In the crosshairs of a multi-million-dollar sensor, a human life is reduced to a mathematical abstraction. 68 specific nodes of biometric data blinking on a server rack in Nevada. This is the apex of the United States intelligence doctrine, the face recognition tracking system. To the command staff of the Joint Special Operations Command, this digital fingerprint is the ultimate guarantor of precision. It is designed to strip the anonymity from the chaos, to find a single high-value courier in the middle of the Basra market, a teeming, high-energy sea of humanity where 10,000 souls move in a rhythmic, unpredictable swarm. The logic is clinical. The machine does not feel fatigue, it does not possess bias, and it does not blink. It simply waits for the geometry of a face to match the database, providing a green light that authorizes a kinetic strike or a high-stakes snatch and grab. But on a sweltering afternoon in southern Iraq, as the ambient temperature climbed toward 50 degrees Celsius, the billion-dollar dream of digital omniscience began to dissolve into a cloud of literal and metaphorical noise. The heat in Basra was not just a physical burden, it was a tactical weapon. As the sun reached its zenith, the ground began to exhale, a thick, shimmering haze of distorted air and microscopic silt known as thermal bloom. To the naked eye, it was merely an uncomfortable glare. To the ultra-sensitive, high-definition matrix of the MQ-9 Reaper drone circling at 18,000 feet, it was a catastrophic interference. The sensor, an engineering marvel designed to see through the darkness of night, was being blinded by the sheer intensity of the day. The thermal noise created grain on the image, causing the 68 points of the recognition algorithm to flicker and shift. The shadows in the creases of a man's face were being interpreted as scars. The sweat on a forehead was being processed as a structural anomaly. The algorithm, unable to achieve the 99% certainty required by the rules of engagement, began to throw errors. It produced a series of yellow alerts, possibilities, not certainties. 2 blocks away, an American snatch-and-grab team sat in the back of an up-armored vehicle, their engines idling, their hearts racing in the sterile, air-conditioned silence of their own technological bubble. They were the most lethal, short-range force on the planet, yet they were effectively paralyzed. Their doctrine was absolute. They do not move until the system confirms the target. They had been trained to view their own eyes as secondary sensors, prone to the fallibility of adrenaline and human error. They were waiting for the green light from a computer 5,000 miles away, while the target, the courier who held the keys to the regional insurgent network, was slowly threading his way through the market stalls, moving closer to the point of evaporation. The American operators were data-starved in a world of infinite information, held hostage by an algorithm that was currently struggling to distinguish a human jawline from the shadow of a canvas merchant's tent. In that same moment, less than 10 meters from the target, a lone figure adjusted the folds of an old, faded silk scarf around his neck. He was not wearing a helmet integrated with a heads-up display. He was not carrying a ruggedized tablet linked to a satellite feed. He was an operator from the British Special Air Service, and for him, the silk scarf was the most important piece of technology in the theater. It was a tool of the thinking soldier. The silk did not just mask his identity, it managed his environment. It wiped the salt sting of sweat from his eyes so his vision remained sharp. It acted as a crude but effective filter against the silt-laden wind. Most importantly, it allowed him to exist within the rhythm of the crowd rather than hovering above it.
While the Pentagon's machines were hunting for 68 nodes of geometry, the SAS operator was hunting for the shadow, the subtle, sociological cues of a man who knows he is being watched, or a man who commands a hidden respect from those he passes. This was the collision between 2 incompatible philosophies of war. The American doctrine sought to automate the truth, believing that if you could build a better sensor, you could eliminate the fog of war. They viewed the battlefield as a geometry problem to be solved by a processor. The British doctrine forged in the brutal, low-tech attrition of the Troubles and the high-altitude isolation of the mountains, viewed the battlefield as a psychological landscape to be navigated by a predator. The Americans were waiting for the machine to tell them what was real. The British were standing in the dust, feeling the reality for themselves. As the drone's sensor continued to struggle with the grain and the haze, the mission hit a state of structural paralysis. The US team was a lance without a tip, unable to strike because their guidance system had been blinded by a handful of dust. When technology becomes the sole foundation of your operational confidence, a simple environmental shift can become a terminal failure. The green light wasn't coming, the signal-to-noise ratio was collapsing, and the courier was seconds away from disappearing into the labyrinth of the old city. The American system had optimized for the perfect shot, but it had failed to prepare for the dirty reality. They had built a military that required the world to be a clear, high-resolution mirror, and when the world turned out to be opaque and gritty, they lost their ability to act. If you are interested in the anatomy of modern conflict and the brutal, uncomfortable reality of what it takes to survive when the algorithms fail and the true soldiering begins, subscribe to the channel. We are exploring the hidden history of these tactical failures, not to criticize the men on the ground, but to understand why even the most advanced military machine in history can be brought to its knees by the simple, brutal physics of a market square. This story is not just about a botched identification. It is about the structural arrogance of a mindset that treats the human eye as a legacy system. We are about to strip away the myths of the all-seeing sensor and descend into the truth of the Basra market. Stay with us as we dismantle the logic of the pixel and see how the SAS, when faced with the same digital void, arrived not with a computer, but with a piece of silk and the resolve to look the enemy in the eye. We are moving into the heart of the silk and the sensor debate, the moment where the $5 cloth proved to be more lethal than the billion-dollar satellite. The American military's commitment to the automation of target identification is not a product of technical obsession or a lack of tactical nerve. It is the most sophisticated manifestation of a humanitarian and political imperative to eliminate the human element of error. This is the doctrine of the infallible strike. For decades, the United States has operated under the heavy shadow of the strategic corporal. The idea that a single mistake by a lone soldier on the ground, a single misidentified target, or one instance of tragic collateral damage can derail an entire national strategy. To solve this, the Pentagon didn't just build better sensors, they built a bureaucratic and technological shield designed to insulate the mission from the fallibility of the human mind. In their view, the human eye is a legacy system. It is prone to the distortions of adrenaline, the bias of fear, and the inevitable fatigue of a 12-hour watch. A machine, however, does not feel the sun in Basra. It does not panic when a crowd begins to surge. It merely calculates. This reliance on automated facial recognition, FRT, and high-altitude biometric tracking represents a total paradigm shift in how sovereignty is exercised on the battlefield. The United States has essentially outsourced the moment of truth, the decision to identify a man as a target, to an algorithm. In the sanitized, high-bandwidth operations centers of the continental United States, this system is a masterpiece of ethical and tactical engineering. It allows a legal officer and a commander to sit in a climate-controlled room and wait for a percentage-based confidence interval. If the machine says there is a 99% match between the pixels on the screen and the data in the server, the strike is authorized. This provides the military with a clean kill chain, one that can be audited, verified, and defended in a court of law or a congressional hearing. It is the ultimate expression of war as a managed industrial process, but the logic of the infallible strike carries a hidden terminal cost. It has effectively stripped the soldier on the ground of his tactical agency. In the American doctrine, the operator is no longer the sensor. He is the executor of a decision made by the network.
By prioritizing the digital truth over the human observation, the US command has created a system that is incredibly lethal under perfect conditions, but fundamentally brittle when those conditions drift. In the Basra market, the system was not failing because of a software bug. It was failing because the environment refused to be sterile. The dust, the heat shimmer, and the erratic movement of 10,000 civilians created a level of entropy that the algorithm was never designed to process. The computer didn't see a target. It saw a degradation of data. And because the doctrine demanded 99% certainty, a handful of Iraqi silt was enough to shut down the most powerful military machine in history. This creates the sanitization trap. The American system has become so obsessed with the idea of a perfect identification that it has lost the capacity to manage ambiguity. When the Reaper drone's sensor hit the lithological wall of the desert haze, the command structure didn't tell the ground team to use their judgment. They told them to wait. They were waiting for a digital green light that was physically impossible to generate in a sandstorm. The American operators, elite warriors who had spent years mastering the art of the strike, were reduced to the role of spectators, tethered to a monitor that was currently displaying nothing but grain. They were held hostage by their own desire for moral and tactical certainty. In their quest to ensure they never hit the wrong man, they had created a situation where they could no longer hit the right one. The institutional arrogance of this approach lies in the belief that the God's eye view of a satellite is inherently superior to the primal view of a human being. The Pentagon had spent billions to move the decision-making process away from the mud and blood of the street and into the glass and silicon of the headquarters. They believed that distance equals objectivity, but in a counterinsurgency, distance usually just equals blindness. The algorithm was looking for 68 points of geometry, but it couldn't see the way the target's hand hovered near his waist, or the way the crowd's temperature changed when he entered a specific alleyway. Those are sociological markers, not mathematical ones. By digitizing the target, the Americans had removed him from his context. They were looking at a face in a vacuum, while the SAS were looking at a man in a city. This failure of the digital matrix in Basra was a symptom of a larger pathology: the belief that technology can legislate the uncertainty out of war. The American commanders were managing a simulation of the battle, and when the simulation hit a data gap, they froze. They had built a military that required the world to be transparent, predictable, and compliant with their sensors. When the world turned out to be opaque, chaotic, and dusty, they realized, too late, that they had unlearned the most basic skill of the soldier: the ability to trust one's own eyes. They were the most informed army in history, and in that market square, they were the most helpless, sitting in their up-armored vehicles, waiting for a server in Nevada to tell them if the man standing 30 meters away was their enemy or a ghost. The sensor had become the master, and the soldier had become the slave to a signal that was currently dissolving into the Iraqi heat. Stay with us as we move into the next chapter, where we explore the philosophy of the thinking soldier and see how the SAS used a piece of silk to do what a billion-dollar algorithm could not. Inside the mobile command post, a cramped, high-tech container armored against the heat of the Iraqi desert, the atmosphere was thick with the smell of scorched insulation and the rhythmic, frantic clicking of keyboards. The American analysts were engaged in a desperate struggle against the environment. On the high-definition monitors, the feed from the Reaper drone was a jittery, over-processed mess of gray and white. They were applying every digital filter in the JSOC arsenal: contrast enhancement, edge detection, frame averaging, trying to stabilize those 68 biometric points on the target's face. But the Iraq dust was indifferent to their software. The algorithm was stuck in a loop, its confidence interval hovering at a useless 64%. To the American tactical commander, a man responsible for the political and ethical fallout of every bullet fired, that 64% was a wall. He couldn't authorize the snatch. He couldn't risk hitting the wrong man and igniting a citywide riot based on a maybe. He was a prisoner of the green light protocol, a system designed to ensure perfection that was now ensuring paralysis. Standing at the back of the unit, leaning against the cold metal casing of a server rack, was a sergeant from the British SAS. He wasn't looking at the monitors. He had been monitoring the target through a secure, low-bandwidth audio link from an operative already on the ground. While the Americans were trying to fix the pixels, the British sergeant was listening to the city. He stepped forward and did something that felt like an act of tactical sabotage to the staff in the room. He reached over and turned off the monitor displaying the biometric data. In the sudden silence of the command post, he made a proposal that challenged the very foundation of the American way of war. He proposed that they stop trying to calculate the target from 18,000 feet and start reading him from 3 meters away. The British philosophy of pattern of life analysis is the polar opposite of the American biometric doctrine. While the Pentagon seeks to identify a target by the physical geometry of their body, the SAS identifies them by the social ripple they create in their environment. The British sergeant argued that in a marketplace like Basra, a high-value courier doesn't exist as a face. He exists as a frequency. He explained that you don't look for the man, you look for the way the crowd reacts to his presence. You look for the social shadow, the way a merchant pauses for a fraction of a second when he passes, the way a group of teenagers stops laughing as he threads through their stall, or the way his hand stays glued to a specific pocket of his robe. This is not data that can be processed by a computer in Nevada. It is sociological intelligence that can only be harvested by a human predator who understands the language of the street. For the American officers, this was a terrifying regression. To their ears, intuition sounded like a polite word for guessing. They argued that the human eye is subjective, that it carries the weight of cognitive bias, and that a mistake on the ground would be a strategic disaster. They demanded the report from the system. They wanted the certainty of the machine. But the SAS sergeant was relentless. He pointed to the monitors, to the flickering, grain-filled images that their billion-dollar system was currently providing. "Your machine is currently telling you that the dust is a person," he said, his voice quiet and devoid of theater. "My man on the ground is telling you that the person is the target. One of those is a simulation. The other is the war." This was the collision between two entirely different military souls. The Americans were fighting to maintain the glass dome of surveillance, a system where the commander oversees the mission like a god. The British were fighting for the tactical autonomy of the operator, a system where the man in the mud is the final authority. The commander was caught in a profound psychological dilemma: stay safe behind the technology and watch the mission fail, or step into the uncertainty of human judgment and take the shot. He looked at the SAS sergeant, then at the empty, dark screens, and realized that his infallible system had left him with no options. The decision to trust the pattern of life over the biometric sensor was the moment the American command relinquished its godlike view and returned to the primal reality of the hunt. It was an admission that in the chaos of a human swarm, the most sophisticated targeting system ever built is still second best to the intuition of a man who knows what fear looks like. If you are interested in the hidden mechanics of special operations and the moments where the simplest human skills outperform the world's most advanced laboratories, subscribe to the channel. We are exploring the anatomy of tactical choices that decide the fate of missions when the power goes out. The green light was finally given, not by a server, but by a whisper in an earpiece. Stay with us as we witness the ghost in the crowd and the final, clinical capture in the heart of Basra. We are moving into the endgame of the silk and the sensor. The infiltration of the Basra market did not begin with a tactical command or a GPS synchronization. It began with the rhythmic, steady movement of a man who had spent 3 weeks learning the internal heartbeat of the city. The SAS operator did not look like a soldier.
He looked like a weary traveler navigating the late afternoon heat. He wore a loose-fitting linen shirt, sun-bleached trousers, and the old faded silk scarf wrapped loosely around his neck and lower face. In the American tactical framework, a scarf is a piece of protective apparel, a barrier against dust and flash. For the SAS operator, the silk was a sensory management system. It was breathable enough to prevent the fogging of his vision, yet dense enough to filter out the fine Iraqi silt that was currently turning the American drone feeds into a useless haze of grey noise. He moved not against the crowd, but within it, matching the shuffling, unhurried cadence of the bazaar. While the technicians at the command center were obsessing over the 68 nodes of facial geometry, the SAS operator was performing a sociological scan. He was looking for the social shadow, the invisible ripple that a high-value asset leaves in the human wake of a city. He didn't need to see the courier's jawline to identify him. He saw the way a group of 3 young men standing near a spice stall instinctively lowered their voices as the target passed. He saw the way the street's natural traffic pattern altered, creating a subtle 3-meter vacuum around the courier, a sign of unstated respect and profound local fear. This was data that existed entirely outside the electromagnetic spectrum. It was information that required a physical presence to harvest. The drone, hovering miles above, could see the heat of the bodies, but it couldn't sense the temperature of the room. The heat in the market was a physical presence, a heavy, airless weight that smelled of diesel, raw lamb, and ancient dust.
The operator utilized the silk scarf to wipe the stinging salt from his eyes, ensuring his vision remained sharp for the moment of contact. He was operating in the state of high-fidelity awareness that no digital sensor could replicate. He noted the way the target's right hand stayed rigidly fixed to the interior pocket of his robe, not to reach for a weapon, but to protect the data he was carrying. He saw the way the courier stepped over a puddle of stagnant water with a specific, calculated grace, a movement pattern that suggested a man who had been trained to maintain balance and posture even in the most chaotic environments. Every detail was a confirmation, a piece of a puzzle that the American algorithm had discarded as background noise. The gap between the American command's perception and the operator's reality was growing by the second. In Nevada, analysts were still arguing over the grain of the image, adjusting the contrast of a ghost. They were managing a mission in a world that was flat, digital, and manageable. The SAS operator, however, was living in a world that was deep, tactile, and unpredictable. He understood that the courier was not a set of coordinates. He was a human being who was beginning to feel the first, cold tremors of suspicion. The target had stopped to inspect a tray of silver trinkets, but his eyes weren't on the metal. He was looking at the reflection in the polished surface, checking the shadows behind him. The operator slowed his pace, feigning interest in a nearby stall of woven rugs, the silk of his scarf catching the slight hot breeze. This was the acoustic and visual mastery of the SAS in its purest form. They had exploited the enemy's reliance on the American military's own technological predictability. The courier was listening for the sound of a heavy engine. He was looking for the telltale flicker of a laser designator or the silhouette of an armored formation. He was looking for the American signature. He was not looking for a man with a silk scarf who moved with the indifference of a local merchant. By removing the high-tech signature, the SAS had bypassed the courier's entire defensive psychology. The target was prepared for a war of technology, and he was being hunted in a war of shadows. The approach was silent and clinical. As the courier turned into a narrower, shaded alleyway that led toward the residential district, the SAS operator closed the final 5 meters. He didn't rush. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't announce his presence with a tactical shout.
He simply adjusted the silk scarf one last time, stepped into the courier's personal space, and placed a firm, steady hand on the man's shoulder. It was a gesture of absolute, terrifying calm. In that moment, the target's cognitive process hit a wall. He had been prepared to flee from a raid. He was not prepared to be tapped on the shoulder by a ghost. The silence of the encounter was the primary weapon. Before the courier could draw a breath to scream or a hand to fight, he was neutralized by the sheer, overwhelming confidence of the operator's presence. The extraction was executed before the dust of the courier's footprint had even settled. An unmarked, dust-covered civilian car pulled to the mouth of the alley. The operator and the target stepped into the rear seat with the fluidity of two friends entering a taxi. No shots were fired. No sirens were activated. No drones were signaled for a strike. The entire capture had taken place in the blind spot of the American digital overlay. While the analysts 5,000 miles away were still debating whether the bit rate of the thermal feed was high enough to justify a probability of identification report, the high-value asset was already being driven toward a secure interrogation site.
The American system had spent millions to create a God's eye view, yet it had remained entirely blind to the human transaction that had just concluded in the heart of the market. They were looking for pixels in a world made of people. They were waiting for a green light from a computer that couldn't understand the meaning of a silk scarf or the nuance of a fearful glance. The SAS had won the mission not by being faster or more powerful, but by being more human. They had recognized that in the chaos of a city, the most effective sensor is not the one that looks down from the sky, but the one that looks across the street. The silk had held firm, the eye had remained clear, and the target had vanished into the shadows, leaving the most powerful military machine on Earth to continue its frantic, useless troubleshooting of a screen that was already empty. Stay with us for the final transformation of the American command, as they are forced to confront the true weight of the silk. The dawn light that filtered into the mobile command post was thin, clinical, and unforgiving, stripping away the artificial blue-hued glow of the wall-to-wall monitors and revealing the profound fatigue etched into the faces of the American staff. The mission was a technical success, but a doctrinal failure. The high-value courier was already in a secure holding cell, processed and silenced before the first call to prayer had even reached the outskirts of Basra. In the center of the briefing room, the American intelligence officer stood motionless, his gaze fixed on a stack of high-resolution satellite printouts. They were masterpieces of modern optics, images that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to capture, yet they were nothing more than a chaotic jumble of gray blobs, digital artifacts, and thermal noise. They were the evidence of a billion-dollar system that had spent the previous 4 hours hallucinating. On the table next to these useless data logs lay the British operator's silk scarf. It was old, frayed at the edges, and heavily stained with the fine reddish silt of the southern marshes and the salt-rimed residue of human sweat. It smelled of the market, a pungent, honest mixture of diesel exhaust, raw spice, and the unwashed reality of a city under siege. It was a visual and sensory summation of a failed philosophy. The American officer looked from the perfect binoculars his system had provided, the digital sensors that were supposed to eliminate the fog of war, to the simple, unrefined piece of cloth that had actually navigated the target area. The realization was not a sudden explosion of insight, but a slow, heavy, and irreversible descent into the truth. His military had spent a decade building a better lens, but in the process, they had forgotten how to teach their soldiers to see. The British operator didn't offer a lecture, and he didn't wait for a debriefing. He simply acknowledged the American officer with a brief, professional nod and reclaimed his scarf,
tucking it into a side pocket with the indifference of a craftsman stowing a well-used tool. It was the recognition of one professional for another, but it contained a quiet, devastating message. The American God's eye view was an illusion. The Pentagon had optimized its forces for a war that happens in a vacuum, a war where the targets are geometric and the environment is transparent. But the city of Basra had reminded them that the world is a social, messy, and uncooperative organism. The biometric algorithm had been looking for 68 points of data on a face, unaware that the only data point that mattered was the one the machine couldn't register: the way a crowd of humans reacts to the presence of a predator. This was the institutional pivot point. For the American command, the Basra snatch became a masterclass in the necessity of human-centric intelligence. They saw, in the grain-filled images and the low-confidence alerts, a template for their own obsolescence. They began to realize that their people had become too digital, not because of the tablets in their hands, but because of the psychological weight of the information they had been trained to consider absolute. They had developed an addiction to the green light, a dependency that functioned like a sensory deprivation chamber. It gave them a feeling of total control when the signal was clear, but left them in a state of tactical paralysis the moment the dust began to rise. The legacy of that afternoon and the piece of silk that had guided the operator through the most dangerous market on Earth would ripple through the special operations community long after the Iraq War had concluded. It became a piece of foundational lore, a story told in the quiet corners of training facilities, a reminder that the most sophisticated targeting systems in the world are ultimately subordinate to the mind and the eye of the operator. The American military didn't stop using facial recognition, and they didn't abandon their commitment to drone surveillance. But the culture shifted in a fundamental way. They began to reincorporate the analog skills of the SAS, teaching their elite operators how to read the social shadow, how to function in total electronic silence, and how to maintain the initiative when the algorithm starts to flicker. The American officer watched as the SAS team disappeared back into their austere compound, leaving the command post to continue its useless processing of a mission that was already over. He realized now that the smart battlefield is an illusion that lasts only until the power fails or the weather changes. The British had won not because they had more processing power, but because they had more presence. They had proven that in the high-stakes geometry of urban tracking, the most lethal sensor you will ever possess is not the one orbiting the planet, but the one sitting inside your own skull. As the sun rose higher, bleaching the color from the Basra sky, the commander finally closed the lid of his ruggedized laptop. He looked at the empty screen, and for the first time in years, he didn't see a data source. He just saw his own reflection. He had finally recognized that the true master of the battlefield is not the one who can project the most data, but the one who can walk through the heart of the chaos and see the truth for themselves. The era of the all-knowing warrior was not dead, but it had been humbled, brought to its knees by the cold, manual precision of a $5 silk scarf. The tool that had proven that when you are fighting for the control of a city, the most dangerous thing you can do is let the machine tell you what is real. The digital tether was cut, the green light was a lie, and for the first time, he was finally ready to fight in the real world, relying on the only sensor that never runs out of batteries, the human eye, guided by the cold, unyielding intellect of the thinking soldier. If you are interested in the evolution of special operations from the era of mass protection to the era of tactical psychological influence, subscribe to the channel, where we continue to deconstruct the myths of the battlefield and look at the moments where the old ways died. The lithium wall had been bypassed, the sensor had been humbled, and the lesson had been paid for in time and pride. Stay with us as we witness the paradox of the analog raid in the heart of a digital war. In the end, it isn't the machine that wins.
It is the man who knows how to survive without it.